Hello, my name's Adam Winstock and I'm the CEO and founder of Global Drug Survey, and I'd like to take you through some of our highlights from this year's survey. The full report's available on the website, but this is just kind of to give you a bit of a taste of what we found out. We first of all want to say thank you to the 115,000 people who took part. Again, we just can't thank them enough for sharing their expertise and time. In fact, over the last 4 years, we've got to thank more than 400,000 people who have taken part in all of our surveys. And our next survey, Global Drug Survey 2018, launches in October of 2017. So I want to start off just by looking at the world's most popular drugs. And to be honest, there's no great surprise if we look at the drugs that people have used across their lifetime. They're the things that most of us have heard of. There's a few things that are kind of relatively new, but they're kind of really far down the line. And I just want you to look at LSD analogues at 7.4%. That's something that we started seeing last year, but has really kind of picked up steam this year. And if you look at lifetime drugs minus all the legal things, you can see just how many psychedelics there are in the top 11 drugs. If we look at the last year drugs, again, dominated by the things that we're all familiar with. Again, taking away the ones that are legal, what you're left with is the drugs that people have always been using. And I guess the thing that's really important here to think about is that despite the column inches and media headlines that we see around novel drugs, they are still a relatively rare group of drugs among your everyday person who uses drugs. We always look at the acute risk of harm because so often these things are meaningful to people, and also they're relatively easy to avoid by not taking too much too often and not mixing drink and drugs together. Now, for the last 4 years, the synthetic cannabinoids have been the drugs that have been more likely to land you in A&E than any other drugs. We've never included data on methamphetamine and amphetamine before, and now we have. You can see that these are the drugs that carry the greatest risk. However, synthetic cannabinoids are still up there with about 1 in 8, 1 in 9 users who have used 50 or more times in the last year seeking emergency medical treatment. There are a couple of things here, though, that I want to just point out. The first is that for most drugs, it was women who were more likely to seek emergency medical treatment than men. That might be something around their physiology, or it might be that women use in different ways that make it more risky, or it might be that women are more likely to seek treatment. The other things that are interesting, and we'll come back to later on this presentation, is the fact that the proportion of last year MDMA users who took part in our study seeking emergency medical treatment has gone up from 0.9% last year to 1.3% this year. And very interestingly, 1% of cocaine users have sought emergency medical treatment. That also represents a significant increase on previous years. The drug that was least likely to land you in A&E this year were magic mushrooms. Now, of course, most people weren't using magic mushrooms on more than 2 or 3 occasions, but I think what it says is that these drugs, particularly as long as you don't pick the wrong ones, poisonous fungi can lead you into real problems, are a relatively safe sort of drug. Again, thinking about set and setting and making sure you're with trusted people in a safe environment. Alcohol remains the world's most popular drug, and I don't want to dwell on very much other than the fact that an awful lot of people out there want to drink less. With the Mexicans, the Icelandics, the Finns, all up there, with almost half of the drinkers who took part in our survey wanting to drink less. But overall, it was about 1 in 3 drinkers wanted to drink less, and about 10 or 15% of those would like some sort of help. The sort of help that was most acceptable to people was actually online digital apps. And Global Drug Survey has created a free app that's available on the app stores and online at drinksmeter.com that allows you to estimate how much you're drinking, gives you advice on your personal risk, and gives you feedback on things like calories and the amount of money that you're spending. And it also, of course, compares you to other people and adjusts your own personal risk based on your medical history. So if you're worried about your drinking, why don't you go and check that out? Now, every year we get lots and lots of cannabis users. This year we had just shy of 70,000. And the things I really want to kind of focus are that just for so many people, tobacco and cannabis go together. So smoking joints is the most common way that people use cannabis in the world. About 70% of people use joints, but 85% of people who roll joints use tobacco. And of course, tobacco is something that kills you, increases your risk of dependence, and unfortunately, cannabis is the gateway drug for so many people to tobacco. The first time people are exposed to tobacco very often is when they smoke a joint. And I think at a public health level, we have to do more to dissociate cannabis from tobacco. And in fact, if you're watching this and you smoke cannabis with tobacco, the best thing you can do for your health is get rid of tobacco. And you don't have to use cannabis with tobacco. In fact, if you look across the world, there are some countries who have just got it right. The Americans get the gold medal. Only 8% of Americans use tobacco when they use cannabis. Now, the Americans tend not to use joints, they tend to use pipes and bongs, but the Americans are also one of the highest groups when it comes to vaping. So again, getting rid of tobacco out of smoking cannabis is a really good thing. Vaping would obviously be an even better way of smoking. Of course, there's different sorts of cannabis around the world, and I have a sense that we might be seeing a shift away from very high potency cannabis in some countries towards herbal preparations with lower levels of THC balanced by some CBD, while other forms are still a minority in most countries. So as you can see, it's only about 14% of people who are using resins, and even less when it comes to using concentrates. Again, huge variation between countries, with the US and Canada, around 10% of cannabis users there reporting the use of concentrates. The other thing that I think might surprise people is just how many people want to use less cannabis. It's almost the same as the proportion of drinkers who'd like to drink less. And there's quite a lot of people out there who'd like some help to use less. And in fact, if you'd like to use less, we've got a number of tools that we'll talk to you about in just a second. But one of the things that I can't explain is why there's been a relatively dramatic fall in the proportion of cannabis users seeking emergency medical treatment this year. Over the last 3 years, it's been around a 1% level, but it's fallen back down. I'm not sure if that's something to do with our sampling or the way people are using cannabis, but I guess we have to interpret it as good news. If you'd like some help using less cannabis, we've got some free apps. So there's the drugs meter, but there's also saferuselimits.co, which is kind of like a 3-minute self-assessment with some really good advice. And we're also just about to launch a video to help people who want to use less or stop. That'll be available on our website shortly. I guess I just have to mention vaping, because vaping's clearly huge business, and although it's dominated by people using cannabis, we are starting to see other drugs being vaped, particularly DMT, and to a lesser extent drugs like crystal meth. It doesn't necessarily make a drug safer, but I think it's going to alter people's attitude towards drugs and may lead to different patterns of use. It's definitely something to watch. Now, the other thing that we looked at very briefly was the whole issue of cannabis regulation. We're probably going to run this again to get a whole bunch more people to take part. We had about 8,000 people from around the world who gave us their feedback on how they'd like to see cannabis regulated. And for me, what it said is that people who use cannabis just understand that it's so important for governments not to make the same mistakes that were made with alcohol. As you can see, almost half of the people who responded to this part of the survey wanted to see minimum pricing based on THC, and quite a lot of them also wanted to see reduced taxation for forms of cannabis that were balanced by CBD. Really sensible. In terms of who people want to see regulating the cannabis market and selling it, that's not the government. They want that to be in the hand of private companies or non-for-profit organisations. We were also really impressed by how many people wanted to see governments produce guidelines as they produce for alcohol. And it strikes me as being very odd that so many countries that have already introduced a regulated market don't have it. But fear not. Global Drug Survey, with the help of 40,000 people a few years ago, created the world's first guidelines on safer cannabis use that specifically looked at how much you can smoke, how often, and what the different levels of risk were. And at saferuselimits.co, you'll also get advice how to reduce your risk and how to cut down or stop. And this will be supported by the video that we'll be launching later this month. Cocaine comes after cannabis in terms of the world's most common illicitly used drugs, along with MDMA. And Cocaine's a pretty expensive drug in most countries, and that's reflected by the fact that most people tend to use 10 times or less a year. But this 50% figure has actually dropped from last year, where it was around 70%. And in fact, I think what we're starting to see is a shift in patterns of cocaine use around the world, not only in where people are getting it. It's interesting that about 4% of people globally were taking it from the Darknet. Again, that was much higher in some countries than other, particularly Nordic countries. But I think what we're also shifting towards is perhaps a period of time where cocaine's causing more problems for people. And you can see that about 25 to 30% of people reported that over the last year, actually they'd noticed they were using more and using more frequently. And for some people, that was leading to increasing worries over their use. What it also led to, and I think it's related, is an increase in the proportion of people globally and in many of the countries that we look at who sought emergency medical treatment. I was particularly interested in the UK, where I know that the purity of street-level cocaine has doubled over the last 5 years from about 20% to 40%, and what we can see is a doubling over the last 3 years in the proportion of people seeking emergency treatment after using cocaine. And people present with agitation, anxiety, palpitations, sweating, sometimes aggression. It's about having too much stress on your heart. And I think with cocaine purity in some countries reaching 60 or 70%, I think it's important for people to test those and use less at a time. And of course, drinking a lot of alcohol when you use coke also increases those acute risks. And I think that it's an era where we're seeing increased purity for a lot of drugs. And this is the data from the UK that just demonstrates what I've said about rising purities of drugs. And this is evidence from the London Ambulance Service that we've also seen a rise in the number of emergency call-outs. It is a case of using better quality drugs more carefully. Now, we've done lots and lots of research on MDMA, probably about 100,000 people over the last 4 years. And I just want to share some of the highlights this year. The first thing is to say that the stereotype of someone going out doing MDMA every week really isn't borne out by our data, with the average number of times that someone in our study who had taken MDMA being just 9. Now, across the world, the most common way of taking MDMA is still swallowing a pill or a capsule, but there is huge variation. The Danes and the Kiwis, for example, about 30% of them tend to snort their MDMA. The Italians like dissolving it in a drink. Other people like bombing it and wrapping it. Now, whether or not there is a particular link between how you take your MDMA and your risk, we're not 100% sure. What we know is that snorting carries risks of getting higher levels in your blood much more quickly. People tend to want to redose more frequently. And of course, sharing straws and things can be a risk for spreading hepatitis C. It's something that we'll do a bit more work on in the coming months. Now, there's been a lot of interest in the whole idea of drug checking. And as this slide shows, across the world, it's still something that happens not that often, with only about 10% of people reporting they'd got their pills or powders tested. Now, again, there was a huge variation across countries, higher rates of testing in countries like Switzerland, but even in the Netherlands, where there's very good access to drug testing, only about 11.7% of people had used pill testing in the last year. Until drug checking or better quality drugs is routinely available, what people are going to have to rely upon is being really careful when they take a drug of unknown composition or purity. And one of the things Global Drug Survey, among other groups, has been pushing is the idea of test dosing a new batch. And it was really reassuring to see that about 60% of people around the world tended to test dose from a new batch, both of pills and powders. That's a really good thing. In terms of people seeking treatment, though, across the world, what we're doing is seeing a bit of an increase in the number of people seeking treatment. It's gone up to 1.2% of last year users, with young women being particularly at risk. As globally as I've said, that's gone up. That's not the case in every country, and in fact in the UK we saw a reduction this year from 1.2% of last year users to 0.8%. Again, is that something that reflects variations in our sampling, or is that down to the fact that people who are seeking or to use MDMA in the UK are starting to use more carefully? There are lots of ways you can go about reducing less, and the reason I put this slide up is that about 30 to 40% of people who use MDMA say they'd actually like to use less. The other thing I guess I've got to stress, and if you look at the full report you'll see it, is that of those people who sought emergency medical treatment, half of them were drunk before they took their first dose of MDMA. Only 20% of people said they'd test dosed that night. About 40% of people said they didn't feel mentally or physically well before they started using drugs that evening. And I think there's some really important lessons. What you do or what you don't do hugely influences your risk of running into problems. And the truth is that most people seem to be using MDMA really sensibly, but given variations in pill and powder purity, there's always going to be a risk. So look out for yourself and your mates. We collaborated with lots of groups this year to look at LSD and magic mushrooms for the first time. And I think some of the interesting things, particularly that we spotted in the UK, is that I think that there's been a resurgence of interest in psychedelics, particularly the LSD analogues. And I think the other thing that we've heard a lot about recently is LSD and magic mushrooms being used for microdosing, that is taking very small amounts. And our data would suggest this is actually fairly commonplace, with about 1 in 3 people saying they had used LSD for very minimal experiences. We did some more work on this, which suggested actually the majority of people who had microdosed did so very, very rarely, 1 or 2 times. There were 2 or 3% of people who said they actually used regularly, though, to enhance performance or to manage psychological or medical problems. There's more on the website if you want to read about that. I mentioned earlier that the drugs that were least likely to land you in A&E were magic mushrooms. That was 0.2% of last year users. LSD is a much more variable drug. You don't know how much is in your tab or your sugar cube. And here we had 1% of last year users. It's really a case of having to, again, test dose a new batch, because you just don't know how strong it is. And there's a huge difference between a 75 microgram dose and a 300 microgram dose. Now, across the world, a lot of people tend to use magic mushrooms more frequently than LSD, but they're used in very similar ways. And we've seen here about 1 in 3 people reporting microdosing with magic mushrooms. One of the interesting things, though, is that while most people will either take a tab of acid or liquid dissolved on a sugar drop, there's slightly more variation in the way that people can use mushrooms. They can grind it up, they can use them whole, or they can cook it in food. And in terms of where people get it, this varied. A lot of people picked their own or got it from their friends, while in countries like Italy, the most common source of magic mushrooms were from dealers. The most important thing, of course, is that you always take the right magic mushrooms. Despite the fact that only 0.2% of people sought help, these drugs can induce intense experiences that can be overwhelming and frightening, and very rarely can cause problems. And again, if you look on the website, we've got some very useful links to some really good resources to help both you and other people manage someone who might be having a bad trip. We looked at a number of other aspects in the psychedelic section this year, and I guess the thing I want to really stress here is that actually experiencing difficult or negative experiences under the influence of psychedelics is actually relatively rare, and it does vary hugely across different psychedelic drugs, being least common with magic mushrooms, that's psilocybin, DMT and the 2CB drugs, and much more likely to occur with the more potent psychedelics such as N-bohms, peyote and ayahuasca. But what was interesting is that when we asked people to think back to the last time they had a difficult or negative experience, only in about half of cases did they say they would define that as a bad trip. So there really is a big difference between difficult and bad. Again, here are the links to resources I mentioned just a moment ago about how to use magic mushrooms more safely and how to help people with a bad trip. The final bit here is, of course, that the idea that people use psychedelics in a reckless way to escape from reality really isn't borne out by the fact. People use psychedelics for lots of reasons, but to learn about themselves and the world around them seems to be a really strong motivation for people using these very interesting drugs. There's still, however, quite a lot of stigma about talking about them, and only about 50% of people disclosed it to their family. And where they didn't, it was because they were fearful of a negative response. Just coming back to microdosing, it is happening. It's an area that we're going to see more and more research in, and its potential benefits both in improving people's health and well-being, I think, is only just starting to be explored. Now, NPSs are something that Global Drug Survey has conducted vast amounts of information on over the last 6 years. We've produced some of the biggest reports on the synthetic cannabinoids and a lot of profiling reports on drugs such as methadone, methoxetamine, and some of the new LSD analogues. What I want to talk about just here is that variations in purchase tend to kind of reflect an awful lot of things. And I was about to say that it reflected ease of access to drugs in your country. But in fact, what you can see is that second to the US, the country with the biggest rates of NPS purchase in the last 12 months were actually the Netherlands. And that might be on the back of relative dissatisfaction with very high quality MDMA. It's rather strange. In terms of NPS use levels, there's obviously a lot of similarity between this and those people who are purchasing. But again, with the highest rates in the Netherlands, where that's probably dominated by people using 4-fluoroamphetamine, which has just recently been banned. But the Americans, really high rates of use, along with those people in the United Kingdom and other Nordic countries. What's changed over the last few years, certainly among those people responding to the Global Drug Survey, are the change in preparations. We're seeing a reduction in herbal preparations, pills and powders, and an increase in tablets and liquids. Now, that's not to say that herbal synthetic cannabinoids are not remaining a huge issue for particularly marginalized groups, the homeless, those people with mental health problems, those people in prisons. But among the wider drug using community, it may be that they are losing interest in synthetic cannabinoid products. And this is also reflected by the fact that the drug effect that NPSs are most frequently trying to mimic now are actually the psychedelics like LSD. Again, there's a lot more information available, and we are able to provide bespoke reports to organisations and countries if you'd like to get more information. We've got fantastic data on the Darknet. I think the Global Drug Survey has produced some of the biggest reports in this area, and we're blessed to work with Monica Barrett, who's part of the core research team, along with Jason Ferris and Larissa Marr. And again, what this shows is huge variation in interest in darknet shopping, highest in countries from Scandinavia, but also in the UK. Relatively little interest in those countries where drugs are relatively easy to get hold of, or where you've got a really small island with a lot of cooperation between postal and customs, like New Zealand. Looking just at English-speaking countries, and we've got graphs for this for the rest of the world, what we're seeing is a year-on-year increase in most countries, apart from, as I said, New Zealand, where the darknet really doesn't seem to have broken through yet. What also hasn't changed very much over the last 3 years is the sorts of drugs that people are buying. The darknet shopping is still dominated by MDMA, cannabis and LSD, although it's really interesting that the third most common group of drugs that are being bought are the novel psychoactive drugs. And it's likely as governments bring in bans, making it more difficult to buy these drugs in shops and online, that people will go seeking these drugs on the darknet. One of the other areas that we looked at for the first time was the whole issue of policing. And we did this in collaboration with Caitlin Hughes at the University of New South Wales. And we did it because getting caught with drugs can be hugely stressful. But we also know that drug laws are not necessarily fairly implemented across the world, and there's a big variation depending on what drug you're caught with and maybe the colour of your skin. So we looked at a number of things, particularly the likelihood of being actually caught up with the police when it came to your drug use. And when it came to particularly sniffer dogs, there were 3 countries that really stood out. There was Italy, the UK and Australia. By far and away the most likely countries where you were going to kind of come across sniffer dogs. Across the world it was just about 1 in 10 users. The other interesting thing, if you look on the report or ask us for further information, is that we also asked about those countries where people were offering bribes and whether or not that was a worthwhile thing to do. So I'm not going to talk anymore. There's a lot more information available on the Global Drug Survey Highlight Report, which is available on the website. And if you're interested in testing your knowledge, although to be honest, quite a lot of the answers I would have already given you, then why don't you take 3.5 minutes and do the GDS 2017 quiz. The link is on our website. Until then, I would hope you have a really fantastic 2017. The team is busy planning Global Drug Survey 2018, which is launching in October 2017. If you'd like to help us, or if you'd like to join in Global Drug Survey, then just email us. And as ever, we'd ask you to just stay safe and look out for your mates. And until we start Global Drug Survey 2018 in a few months' time, have a fantastic summer.